for Q&A towards the end. So if we go to the next slide, to give you a sense of what we'll cover today, we'll walk through a quick federal state of play. We'll hear about the latest research and data and findings. We'll have a discussion with our speakers who will share an outlook on the community before, again, opening it up for Q&A. So let's go ahead and get things started with a federal state of play. Next slide. So a recent report came out that highlighted the fact that U.S. employers spend more than $1.7 billion per year to avoid unions from forming in the private sector. Balance this notion with the fact that there are fewer protections in place for workers and the rollbacks that have been taking place to DEIA. As we think about this, consider now the Trump agenda and how it continues to impact AANHPI workers and working families every day by creating those additional barriers to affordability, making it harder and increasing income inequality. To name just a few of these policy considerations at play here, think about these four things. The first, Trump tariffs policies cost families an extra tax increase of $1,000 on average in 2025. In addition to higher household costs, which impacts wages, of course, job losses have also emerged. The second, immigration enforcement and other immigration policies, which over time may cause the labor force to shrink. Third, the laying off of nearly 300,000 federal workers and the impacts that this has had to local and regional economies. And lastly, the tax bill of 2025, aka HR1, aka the big ugly bill, whatever you want to call it, it was intentionally designed to benefit wealthy individuals and corporations through tax cuts by cutting funds to key safety net programs that folks rely on, that workers rely on, such as Medicaid and SNAP. Now, keeping these conditions in mind, it's important for us to have a clear understanding of the current state of AANHPI workers across our communities. So with that, if we go to the next slide, I'm happy to introduce our fantastic panelist of speakers, Karthick Ramakrishnan, Executive Director and founder of AAPI Data. Karthick is also the co-chair of NCAPA's Strategic Narrative Working Group and Data Equity Working Group. Michele Wong, postdoctoral scholar with AAPI Data. Sandra Engle, Executive Director with APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Sydelle Baretto, Policy Manager with NAPAWF, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. And Sina Uipi, Director of National Policy and Advocacy with EPIC, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. Sina is also co-chair of our Data Equity Working Group and leads our Immigration and Health Committees here at NCAPA as well. Welcome, everyone. Super excited to delve into things here. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Karthick, and Michele, over to you.
Thank you, Joanne, and happy Heritage Month, everyone. It's been a very eventful month and really grateful for the many ways that NCAPA staff and coalition members have shown up to make sure that our community's needs and priorities are front and center during a very critical time. In particular, I want to give a major shout out to APALA, but of course, EPIC and NAPAWF are strong partners of AAPI Data as well. Today, the focus is on labor, and I just want to make sure that people recognize not only the resource that Michele is going to be talking about today, but the partnership that we have built with APALA in a joint publication that's going to be coming out next month. Now, you might think, what's so special about June? Well, June is the AFL-CIO convention, and the ability to have a printed resource that highlights some of the findings that you'll see here, as well as others, to make sure that our communities cannot be taken for granted anywhere, including among allies, is a very powerful opportunity. And really grateful for the partnership with APALA in producing this, and more importantly, the kind of data narrative action footing that we are heading into. And that's going to be key. I'll just say finally, with my role as the co-chair of the Strategic Narrative Working Group, we have marked 2026 as the year of action. It is a year-long process. Civic engagement isn't something that just happens once we get to the fall. And I can't think of any stronger civic engagement partner than APALA and the labor movement when it comes to ensuring that our communities, especially those that are marginalized and disadvantaged, have a voice in the civic engagement process. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to, by the way, so this resource will be coming out next month, and we'll be sure to have a place on our website for people to access that resource as well. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Michele Wong, our postdoctoral scholar.
Thank you, Karthick. Okay. So excited to get into our resource guide here. We're going to first start with looking in to some of the key topics we'll cover for today. So please, next slide. And then, of course, here's a QR code so you can go ahead and review this, which we'll have a lot more in detail. We'll go through some of the key points today, but please take a look when you have the chance. Next slide. Okay, so we'll cover 6 areas today. We'll start with a demographic overview, and then we'll move through labor force participation and unemployment, immigration and work authorization, industry and occupation, low-wage work, as well as union membership. Next slide. We'll start with some key facts to know. So AANHPI workers are more than 1 million strong in the union movement, but this headline rate of 8.8% for Asian Americans masks a wide range. So NHPI workers are at 12.5%, so among the most unionized across all racial groups in the country. Next slide. Filipino workers at 15% and Japanese workers at 40% are the most unionized Asian American subgroups, largely because of their concentration in public sector, healthcare, hospitality, and where unions are present and organizing has a longer history. Next slide, please. And so about 1 in 4 AANHPI workers overall are low wage, but this average conceals a range from 13% for Taiwanese workers to nearly 50% for Marshallese and other Micronesian workers. NHPI workers are disproportionately concentrated at the higher end of that range. Next slide. And then when it comes to thinking about the impacts of limited English proficiency among AANHPI workers, those are roughly twice as likely to be low wage as their English proficient counterparts. So with limited English proficiency rates reaching 44% for Asian Americans and 45% for NHPI workers. Next slide. And then the largest single occupational group for AANHPI's workers is among computer engineering and science at 19%. It's more than twice the national rate. And then non-citizen Asian American workers are in the tech industry at 31%. Certainly with many employer-tied visas with limited ability to often think about jobs and organizing, which we'll get more into when we get into the immigrant and work authorization section. Next slide. Okay, so we'll start with some of the basics and really think how many AANHPI workers are we actually talking about? So the total AANHPI population is just over 25.7 million. Of those, about 20 million are working age adults, and roughly 14.9 million are in the labor force. That is a substantial workforce, so nearly 15 million people here. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll look into the labor force and who's unemployed. Next slide. Okay, so overall, 73.9% of AANHPI, and this goes by sex here, men, and 63.5% of AANHPI women are in the labor force. Those numbers are largely similar across Asian American and HPI groups. And HPI women actually have a slightly higher participation rate than Asian American women at 65.3% and 63.4%. Next slide, please. Okay, so then looking here at the unemployment rate, the unemployment rate is 4% across total AANHPI there, and then this is the national average. But again, this aggregate masks a lot of variation. So Uzbek workers have an unemployment rate of 17.8%, more than 4 times the national average there, and then followed by Marshallese workers at 12%. And then here just kind of highlights the top end, but for some of the other workers here highlighted, we have some smaller percentage, such as Japanese and Laotian workers, where the unemployment rate is around 3% there. Next slide. Okay, so for immigration and work authorization, we'll go into some of the key highlights here. So 3/4 of all AANHPI workers are foreign-born. That's a community-wide figure, but it ranges dramatically by subgroup, as you can see here. So Bhutanese workers at 97% are foreign-born, followed by Nepalese at 96%, and Burmese at 94%. These are almost entirely immigrant workforces. And so by contrast, Native Hawaiian workers at 96% US born and Hmong workers at 61% US born. So these are communities where the majority of workers were born here, often US citizens or residents by birth. Next slide. Yeah, so you can see, again, some of the highlights here that I just mentioned. Next slide. Okay, so this chart here, which shows you the top 10 non-immigrant visa issuances by visa class and nationality. A few things stand out here. So at the very top here, you can see that India accounts for 76% of the H-1B specialty occupation visas issued by, and this was issued to Asian countries. So that's certainly an extraordinary concentration. India also accounts for 90% of the H-4 dependent visas, which are primarily spouses of H-1B holders and until recently, like who could not work. And so this also details here some of the other ones. So H-2A and H-2B are seasonal worker programs, are dominated by other countries entirely. So we do have a large percentage of, says 92% were the Philippines there. And then there's also some that we also highlighted here in terms of the J1 and F1 categories as well. And so you can, again, take a more detailed look in our web resource guide. Please, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to look a little bit more into the industry and occupation. So UNAPI workers look fairly similar to the US workforce at the industry level in some sectors. Here highlighted, we have education, health, and social assistance is a top industry for both groups at about 25 to 26%. But UNAPI workers are notably more concentrated in professional and scientific services, so around 16% and 11.6% nationally. They're underrepresented in agriculture and construction, which together account for 7.3% of all US workers, but only 2.6% of UNAPI workers. Next slide. Okay, and then at the occupation level, the UNAPI US gap is even starker. UNAPI workers are in computer engineering and science occupations at 19% compared to 7.7 nationally, and that's about 2.5 times the national rate. At the same time, UNAPI workers are underrepresented in trades, construction, and transportation. So a significant share of UNAPI workers are in well-paid professional roles, but another significant share are in service, production, and low-wage work. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we break Asian American occupation by sex, the differences are substantial. Asian American men are concentrated in computer, engineering, and science at 27%, more than twice the rate of Asian American women at 12.3%. Asian American women are more concentrated in healthcare practitioner fields at 13.7%, service occupations at 17%, and office and administrative support at 11.4%. So these are occupations with very different wage profiles, union coverage, and working conditions. The occupational gender gap within the community has real implications certainly for pay equity and labor protections. Next slide. Looking here at the occupation distribution of NHPI workers by sex, also very different occupational profiles than Asian Americans. So the top occupation for both NHPI men and women is service, 18.6% and 21.6% respectively. That's nearly double the rate for Asian Americans. NHPI men are heavily represented in transportation and material moving at 14%, in construction at 8%, and NHPI women have notable concentrations in office and administrative support at around 19.6% and healthcare at 7.7%. Next slide, please. Okay, so for low-wage work, this here will focus on rate of low-wage UNAPI workers by subgroup. So overall, about 1 in 4 UNAPI workers, so about 24%, are low-wage. NHPI workers are at 32.7%, meaningfully higher than the Asian American rate of 23.6%. But then we look at the subgroup range here. We see here at the top, other Micronesian accounts for about 50%, and Marshallese, about 49% of workers are approaching, that means half their workforce being low wage. And then Bhutanese at around 41%, Kazakh around 40%, and Burmese around 39% are all well above the community average. And not shown here, but highlighting that at the lower end, we have Taiwanese around 30% and Asian around 50% as far as those with lowest low wage rates. Next slide. And then looking here again at limited English proficiency status is one of the strongest predictors of low-wage work. Among Asian American workers, those with limited English proficiency have a low wage rate of around 44% compared to 21.8% among English proficient workers. So that's roughly double the rate. For NHPI workers, the limited English proficiency rate is 45% versus around 32% for English proficient workers. So even for Hispanic or Latino workers, limited English proficient workers are at around 52.2% versus 35%. Next slide. And then we'll look at here rate of low-wage workers by citizenship status. So citizenship status also has a clear relationship with low-wage work, but the pattern is more nuanced than you might expect. So for Asian Americans, non-citizens have a low-wage rate of around 25%, which is actually slightly lower than the US-born citizens at around 27%. Naturalized citizens are at around 20%, the lowest of the three groups. For NHPI workers, this picture is different. So non-citizens are at around 41%, well above US-born citizens at around 31%, and naturalized citizens are around 24%, which reflects the different occupational profiles that we highlighted earlier. So non-citizen NHPI workers heavily concentrated in service and production, while non-citizen Asian Americans include a large share, certainly in those high-wage tech roles via maybe H-1B visas. Next slide. Okay, so in our final section, we look at union membership data. Next slide. Some of the raw numbers, which we'll highlight, include around roughly 943,000 Asian American workers and around 84,000 NHPI workers are union members. So it's a little bit over 1 million AANHPI workers that are in the union movement. So, of course, in terms of rates, NHPI workers are at 12.5%, so among the highest unionized of any racial group here, compared to Black workers that come in at 11.4% and white workers at 10.5%. So this is certainly a story that isn't often highlighted here. And then Asian American workers, we highlight at 8.8%. Have among some of the lower, but still, again, kind of roughly amongst like the average with American Indian, Alaska Native workers at 7.5%, and then Hispanic workers at 8.7%. Next slide, please. Okay, so this here we'll look a little bit more into some of the rates by subgroup. You can see here Filipino workers have the highest union membership rate of AAPI ethnic group at 15.4%. And followed by Japanese workers at 13.8, and here showing with the breakdown NHPI workers at an overall 14% here. Next slide. And then when we look at it by sex here, one of the most notable findings is that AANHPI women, 9.7%, are more likely to be union members than AANHPI men at 8.2%. So for Asian Americans specifically, women are at 9.5% and versus men at 7.8%. All right, next slide, please. And then looking further by industry, the industry breakdown confirms like what we'd expect here. So public administration has by far the highest union rate for AANHPI workers at 34.5%, followed by transportation and warehousing at 19%, and education and healthcare at 16.5%. And so the professional and scientific services, where large numbers of AANHPI workers are concentrated, has just a union rate of just 1.7%. And of course, you can see some key differences here broken down by Asian American and NHPI. So NHPI certainly has a very high concentration in the public administration, as well as on the agriculture, forestry, fishing industry as well. Next slide. Okay, so then by occupation, construction and extraction workers have the highest union rate at 27% overall and around 39% for NHPI workers specifically. Education, legal, and community service occupations are at around 21% overall, and for NHPI workers, around 34%. Computer engineering and science occupations, the single largest occupational category for AANHPI workers, has a union rate of just 4%. So that certainly shows some structural tension there. The jobs that AANHPI workers are most concentrated in are among the hardest to organize sometimes. So yeah, next slide here. Okay, and so finally, we're wanting to look a little bit more in terms of thinking about the geography, where does this matter? So here you can see that Hawaii has by far the highest ANAPI union membership rate at around 28%, driven by the state's historically strong labor movement and the high share of NHPI workers in unionized public sector and hospitality jobs, followed by Alaska at around 16% there. So some of the other ones you can certainly see here, concentrations in New York at around 13% and Washington at around also 12.7 or 13% and California at 11%. Some of the lower ones here, Virginia at around 4% and New Jersey around 5.8%. Next slide. Okay, sorry. I know I probably zipped through some of this data very quickly, but want to leave time for the panelists to be able to discuss this data and sort of the work they're doing here. So we're certainly happy to take questions. Please reach out to info@aapidata.com if you have any questions and want to dig a little deeper into this work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michele. Let's go ahead and walk through some of the findings we just heard, and would love to hear everyone's perspective here from our panelists. So starting with you, Sandra. Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders have a long-standing history of labor organizing, from Native Hawaiian sugar workers to Chinese railroad workers to Filipino and South Asian healthcare workers, among so many other extraordinary throughout time. For gig workers and those employed in those types of industries where we have a lot of independent contract, many ANHPIs in low-wage sectors receive pay below what's considered to be the minimum wage and are seeing their wages withheld. Could you share with us how APALA approaches building collective power at a time when so many folks into the gig industry?
Yeah, first of all, Joanne and Karthick and Michele, thank you so much for NCAPA for putting together this event to talk about a very important subject, I think, to all of our communities. And I also want to thank you for bringing up labor history of ANHPI workers, because there are some powerful stories in our history, and many of them are just not well known. One of the things I like to always talk about is that ANHPI workers were the first to practice cross-racial and cross-ethnic organizing, and they did it because they had to. You can see many examples of this through history, through the 19th century, through the 20th century, where, especially in agriculture, whether it's in the sugar and pineapple fields in Hawaii or agricultural fields in California, where workers were being pitted against each other by the boss, ethnic group against ethnic group. Filipino workers against Japanese workers, Mexican workers against Filipino workers. And workers had to decide that they needed to work together, form solidarity with each other to take on the boss, or they would perpetually be just fighting each other and losing more and more of the share of the pie. And so long before it kind of like became the norm in the labor movement, we figured out that we had to do that as a mode of survival. Also, one of the largest strikes that ever happened in the US, about 30 or 40 years before Homestead strike or Pullman strike, the kind of two big strikes we talk about from the 19th century, happened with Chinese railroad workers in 1857. And they struck at a time when they had no support from the labor movement. I mean, there was outright hostility that we all know about against Chinese workers, specifically from the labor movement, with the labor movement's unashamed and unavowed support for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And despite this, despite no support from the community, no support from the media, complete isolation, 5,000 railroad workers sat down on the job, withheld their labor because they were being treated so inequitably, working dangerous conditions, being paid in scrip. The strike was not successful, but it's a story about how there's something innate about the power of solidarity, of workers figuring out that they're stronger together, that they have more in common across work lines, and that they need to band together in order to fight back against the boss. And I like to always talk about those things because I think if we lean into those examples, they're just as applicable for today. Obviously, if you fast forward to today, the economy is very, very different from what it was in the 19th century. But essentially, the basic needs of why workers organize hasn't really changed. I mean, workers organize because they're fighting for fair wages, for job security, for better health care, for safety on the job. These are things that those Chinese workers were thinking about in 1857 and Amazon workers are thinking about in 2026. So all that is a constant and always sort of the underpinning of why workers organize. I think today, though, you have to think about how jobs and the economy are really shifting and shifting very quickly. You can't talk about this without mentioning AI and how that's going to be such a drastic change for how work is done, how we think about work, how information about how we process everything going around us is going to be filtered and changed. And this is happening in less than a generation. And I think the labor movement, to its credit, is really taking a front role in trying to figure out improved policy to understand how this transition is going to happen and how it won't be at the expense of workers and communities. The other big change that's happening is just the unbelievable growth of gig jobs. And these gig jobs are being driven by tech companies, right? They've figured out a way to sort of gamify jobs. And the brunt of their rush to sort of capitalize and go public and become instant billionaires is the worker. The last person they're thinking about is a person who has to sort of do DoorDash on a Friday night in order to have diapers on Saturday, right? So there's tremendous exploitation going on with gig work. That should be concerning to all of us. And that is something that we need to have a voice in, that we need to have some breaks in the system, and we need to have some ability to protect workers in this kind of economy. The good news is I think that unions are responding to the changes in the workforce. I mean, in the last 15, 20 years, I've seen unbelievable organizing going on, like in the cannabis industry. The Teamsters and EFCW have been doing extraordinary work in that area. And one of the tools that they've been able to use is by going to state legislatures and passing laws around licensing for cannabis operations, that they have to do what's called a PLA, a project labor agreement. So if you're of a certain size, you have to either recognize the union if a majority want to form a union, and or be neutral in the campaign. Joanna mentioned just the extraordinary amount of money that's being spent on anti-union campaigns. Well, it's being spent to make workers like vote against their own interest, right? And often it's very difficult to compete against that, right? Because workers are held captive every day at work. They can hear this constant drum of these anti-messages. And so when you take that opportunity away from employers and workers can freely choose, the outcomes are often very different. And I have to also mention that this week there was an extraordinary union victory in Massachusetts where 70,000, that's 70,000 rideshare drivers won recognition of their union. It is the most extraordinary union victory since the 1940s to have that many workers in one day form a union. And the reason they were able to do this was, again, in the state, they put an issue before the voters. And the issue was whether these workers could have collective bargaining rights. But in addition, they had language in there that said if they were unable to negotiate a contract, it would go to arbitration, which is a powerful tool because very often bosses will stall and drag their feet and fight against workers trying to get a contract. And so with those two things in place, communities set to work organizing these workers. And one of the big drivers in helping to organize this was the Chinese Progressive Association in Boston that just spent incredible energy organizing the Chinese drivers that service their community. And they became a huge part of the campaign. And we were in Boston about a month ago and got to hear directly from the stories of these workers and what they have to deal with to drive for Uber or to drive for Lyft and the challenges that they face. And so to see this succeed as like a very novel approach to organizing, something that we all can support, I think is extraordinary and it's a great model. All that said, the work is not done. And I think this data tells the story of how much work is still left to be done. There are disparities in some sectors where we are not nearly as organized as what the numbers should tell us. And then also when you get into the subgroups and the weakness of the data, not the weakness of what we're doing, but the weakness of the data telling the story of what is happening to certain ethnicities, and our failure to sort of highlight that, our failure to disaggregate that data really does mask real harm that are happening to certain communities, certain immigrant communities. And so we need to constantly be pushing to disaggregate the data. And I'm confident that the work we're doing today, that the work API Data is doing, is a huge part of taking us in that direction, because we can tell the story, but there's pieces of the story that are just hidden from view and that we need to really shine a light on. The last thing I'll say, I know you have other speakers, is that APALA itself is very much committed to the idea of organizing in our communities. We just did an organizing institute where we're trying to identify the next generation of organizers, because we firmly believe that organizers need to be conversant in the language, but also the culture of workers in different sectors. A lot of times when you're organizing in an immigrant community, those workers have perspectives on what unions are based upon where they are from. And so if you come from a place where unions are very much government controlled, or unions are repressive, or unions are whatever, that's sort of the lens by which you look at the US labor movement. And so a lot of it is really just relationship building, trust, answering questions, and having people understand the connection between what is happening at your job today happens because without a union, you have really no options. The boss makes all the decisions. But when you form a union with your coworkers, you have the opportunity to sort of sit across the table and bargain those changes.
Thanks so much, Sandra. And, really appreciate you walking us through where we've been, where we've headed, and the importance of organizing given today's climate so that we can witness those victories along the way. So next, let's talk more about immigration policies and how these policies have directly impacted workers and working families. Based on the data, there is a relatively high rate of low-wage work among Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, specifically among Pacific Islanders who are not considered to be U.S. citizens. Sina, based on your work with EPIC, could you help us contextualize this issue by sharing what this looks like in community and what types of policy solutions are at play here needed to improve those wages that we were mentioning earlier?
Yes, thank you so much, Joanne and Karthick, for the opportunity to join this webinar. Mahalo nui, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to share some perspectives that include some data from EPIC's data report that we released last year, specifically around economic justice. I think it also aligns with some of the data presented earlier. I'm not surprised that some of the findings, especially around the different industries a lot of NHPIs work in and language barriers being a challenge, especially in the context of immigration, right? When we look at NHPI economic data specifically, it definitely can be misleading a lot of the times. The median household income of 73,154 is slightly above the national average, but it's often due to the fact that it's a multi-generational home, which many Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, live in and experience, including people that I know and even in my own family. Per capita income, it tells a different story. NHPIs earn an average of $28,313, which is significantly lower than the national average of $37,638 and the $44,337 earned by white non-Hispanic workers. The individual income gap, it definitely reveals the true economic struggle. Nearly 1 in 3 NHPI workers earn less than $17 an hour, but this masks deep inequalities. For example, low wage rates for Marshallese, similar to what the data was presented earlier, and other Micronesian workers approach around 50%. Marshallese per capita income is only $15,166, with 63% considered low income and 28% living in poverty. High unemployment also hits these groups harder, 11.1% for Marshallese and 9.1% for Tongans, compared to the 6.7% NHPI average. Job concentration explains these gaps. Over half of Marshallese workers are in lower wage manual labor sectors, while Chamorro and Native Hawaiian workers are often more often, in management. These distinct economic realities require different policy responses. I met with some of the Marshallese community in Arkansas a few years ago when we did our listening tour for our policy blueprint, and many of them work in the meat processing and agricultural products industries. And they shared some challenges they face, including being scared to speak up at work, language barriers, elders going back to work after being retired for some time, like even 10 years, being timed for bathroom breaks. Like these, it was hard to listen to, I'm not gonna lie. And these are real families that are being impacted. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to share space with them and for them to even share things that they experience as far as work. You know, they also share that these companies would go to the Marshall Islands and recruit people to work for them. And that's how a lot of them migrate to places like Arkansas. I believe Arkansas has the second largest Marshallese community in the US. As far as non-citizens, right, for NHPI workers and uh, LEP, limited English proficient NHPI workers, you know, we know that they're the most vulnerable, lacking citizenship or language access, and makes it hard for them to report anything at work and push back against, you know, bad employers when it comes down to it. Um, as far as COFA migrants specifically, you know, they are legally authorized to work and pay taxes in the US. There was a 1996 welfare reform law made that made them ineligible for essential federal safety net programs like Medicaid. However, Medicaid was restored in 2020, but implementation at the state level has been slow or even non-existent, especially in red states. In 2024, there was legislation passed that included eligibility for COFA migrants. However, I believe it was SNAP actually that was part of that legislation. It was rolled back under the current administration. So the lack of safety net programs, it prevents them from leaving bad jobs, which acts as a form of wage repression. And we can't talk about, right, like horrible working conditions and low wage jobs without talking about what folks have access to and what they don't have access to, especially when it comes to healthcare. For I'll just touch on this briefly. NHPI women, you know, we face a major wage gap, needing to work nearly 8 extra months annually just to match the earnings of white men. For last year's Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Women's Equal Pay Day, women earned 61 to 65 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men. This disparity leads to enormous lifetime losses, you know, including Native Hawaiian women, you know, can lose nearly $1 million over a 40-year career. You know, the problem is driven by NHPI women being concentrated in lower paying, historically undervalued service and administrative support jobs. So, you know, what do we do and what are we doing about it? Things that we've been continuing to push for, not just, you know, through EPIC, but many other Pacific Islander organizations, as well as broader AANHPI organizations, including NCAPA's, you know, restoring federal benefits for COFA migrants. You know, it's crucial for them, especially when they have access to things like Medicaid and SNAP. It gives them a little bit of economic stability to seek better wages. You know, enforce wage and hour laws where NHPI workers are concentrated, with over half of Marshallese workers in construction and transportation, high wage theft sectors, focused compliance initiatives with culturally appropriate outreach is essential. With staffing cuts at the Department of Labor and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, it's moving us in the wrong direction. Protect and expand union access. NHPI workers have the highest union membership rate of any racial group. You know, that's definitely a data point that I was not aware of, and I'm grateful for the work that that's been done to bring that to light and see how we can uplift that and make sure that there's infrastructure to protect that and as well. And lastly, I'll say, building off of what Sandra had shared earlier, requiring disaggregated data. You can't really uh, fully understand anything, with a median household income of $70,000. It doesn't really tell you anything useful, especially if it's, about a specific group with Marshallese or Micronesian workers. Federal agencies have to disaggregate our data and report our data by subgroups, by gender, by citizenship status, and communities invisible in data stay invisible in policy. We know this. We've been pushing back against this for many, many years. In closing, NHPI economic numbers hide deep disparities based on community, gender, and citizenship. The challenge is Marshallese workers, low income, non-citizen workers, low wage rate, and NHPI women wage gap are policy failures. They're fixable with specific solutions. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sina, for uplifting the importance here of how we need to craft policies that are based on disaggregated data and the unique experiences and needs of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. I appreciate you. So shifting gears here for a moment, and Sina was alluding to this in her points, let's take a closer look in terms of inequities in gender pay. For AANHPI workers, particularly women who are immigrants with limited English proficiency and are employed in low-wage industries such as in hospitality, in nail salons, food service, among others, we know that women face structural barriers to accessing protections against retaliation and accessing livable wages. Every year, NAPAWF does an incredible work pointing to the importance of pay inequity for AANHPI women, and so that we're advocating for pay equity, right? Sydelle, can you tell us more about NAPAWF's work here and what are some of the policy solutions to addressing gender economic inequality?
Thank you, Joanne, for the question, and thank you to AAPI Data and NCAPA for creating the space for this conversation today. And thank you to everyone who made time to listen in on this conversation this afternoon. And so at NAPAWF, we approach our pay equity and economic justice work through a reproductive justice lens, because the ability to decide if, when, and how to build a family is ultimately shaped by whether you have the financial resources, healthcare access, and workplace protections to be able to support yourself and your loved ones. And so every year we use AANHPI Equal Pay Day, which this year was April 7th, as an opportunity to educate policymakers, the media, and the general public about the wage gaps that still persist across our communities, and also to push for structural policy solutions that help to advance economic justice. And so for this year's Equal Pay Day, we had hosted a conversation with Sandra, actually, who is here today, Congresswoman Grace Meng, and then also a representative from a national gender equity organization. We also released fact sheets in partnership with the Institute for Women's Policy Research and the National Partnership for Women and Families. And as was mentioned earlier, AANHPI women earn about 83 cents for every dollar paid to white non-Hispanic men. And, building off of what Sina and others said about data disaggregation, when we disaggregate that data, there are extremely significant disparities. More than half of the 27 subgroups make less than 70 cents for every dollar made by white non-Hispanic men. And so at NAPAWF, by helping to uplift this data, we help to challenge the model minority myth, and really just work towards ensuring that the experiences of low-wage workers, immigrants, refugees, and women with limited English proficiency are included in national conversations about pay equity and labor rights. Our work also recognizes that restrictions on reproductive freedom reinforce barriers to economic justice and economic insecurity, which in turn then makes it harder for people to access healthcare and exercise their bodily autonomy. And so that's why the policy solutions that NAPAWF advocates for are focused on building systems that support both economic security and reproductive freedom. And so, one of the primary policies that we work to champion is the Health Equity and Access under the Law for Immigrant Families Act, also known as the HEAL Act. The HEAL Act recognizes that healthcare access is a fundamental economic justice issue, especially for immigrant communities who are often excluded from public programs and safety net protections because of their immigration status. As was mentioned, Sina mentioned this has come up a few times. Many AANHPI women work in low-wage industries that do not provide employer-sponsored healthcare. Immigrant workers are also more likely to face barriers accessing affordable healthcare, even while they're performing the essential work that helps to keep our economy running. And when workers cannot access that preventative care or reproductive health care or just health coverage for their families, the consequences of that are not only health related, but they're also economic. And so, what the HEAL Act would do is help remove discriminatory exclusions that prevent immigrants from accessing healthcare programs like Medicaid, CHIP, and the Affordable Care Act marketplace. And when we're talking about healthcare access as a barrier, we also have to talk about abortion access specifically, because the ability to decide whether and when to have children directly impacts a person's ability to complete their education, to remain in the workforce, and be able to provide for their family. Approximately 1.3 million AAPI women of reproductive age are currently living in states with restricted abortion access. And so research shows that abortion restrictions lower the likelihood a woman will graduate from school, both high school and college, and also lowers their overall lifetime earnings. Um, in states where abortion is banned, women tend to work more hours per week, and have a lower income. And then also on average, states with abortion restrictions or total bans also tend to have lower minimum wages. Many states that banned abortion after the Dobbs decision also have the biggest gender wage gap. And then lastly, due to the Hyde Amendment, which prevents Medicaid coverage of abortion, abortion becomes effectively banned for low-income communities. So we can see all of these intersections between reproductive healthcare access, abortion access, and economic justice and stability. And so, in addition to working towards more inclusive healthcare systems, NAPAWF also works to advocate for stronger equal pay protections to address persistent wage disparities, and help close the loopholes that allow unequal pay practices to continue. We also support raising labor standards and increasing wages for workers who are concentrated in low wage industries such as hospitality, food service, caregiving, um, that our communities are concentrated in. Then also, if we were able to raise the minimum wage to $17 from the current level, and then also phase out the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, 1 in 7 AAPI women would get a raise. We also continue to push for investments in affordable childcare and caregiving infrastructure. Access to affordable childcare is one of the strongest predictors of whether women are able to remain in the workforce. Yet half of AANHPI women live in childcare deserts where affordable childcare is not accessible to them. But at the same time, childcare workers are, many of them are women of color and immigrants, are also underpaid and undervalued. And so we need to invest in affordable childcare while also ensuring that childcare workers are receiving living wages and benefits. And then I'll just close with this. We recently did polling of women of color through the Intersections of Our Lives collaborative. And something that one of the data points that we found, which I think is particularly striking, is that more than half of AANHPI women say that the American dream no longer feels accessible to them. And I think what this tells us is this is not just about individual workplaces or isolated wage gaps. It's really about building systems where our communities have the resources, the healthcare, the autonomy to thrive. And that economic justice means ensuring that all of our communities have the power to make decisions about our bodies, our families, and our futures, with dignity and safety. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sydelle, and appreciate you helping us to better understand the different intersections here and pointing us to legislation that does address the barriers and wage disparities that so many AANHPI women face. So we'd like to open it up now to some questions for folks. I know that we've got some questions in the chat as well as our Q&A function. Let's go with the first in the chat, pointing to SPD 15. I know a lot of us and our partners have been focused on SPD advocacy, SPD 15 advocacy, given the progress that we'd made and some of the rollbacks that we're now witnessing. So the question is, what would it take to push for SPD 15 level recognition for specific Uzbek communities? And are any of the organizations on our panel here actively advocating for that? Karthick, I'm going to put this question to you, given our work together on the Data Equity Working Group.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. And I think Sina as part of the group too, I'm sure we'll have things to add as well. SPD 15 folks had two different components, right? One is three, I guess, major components. One is to create a combined category of Hispanic origin and race in the same combined category. The other major one was to create a new major category or minimum category, the way they called it, of Middle Eastern and North African. And the third is to mandate data disaggregation for every group, no matter what the minimum category is. So this I see primarily as that third bucket, which is what API Data, EPIC, and many others in the NCAPA Data Equity Working Group and NCAPA as a coalition has been pushing. So that's where that prioritization, it remains a priority, except that with this administration, they have started to, it looks like, slow roll or pause various aspects of SPD 15, including disaggregation. So this remains a priority. Even in the SPD 15 revision, on some of what people would call the edge cases, there was some disagreement and dispute. So for example, the Armenian population not being lifted up as an example in the MENA category caused some consternation. And I know in the Afghan community, there's a big question about whether, it's Asian or Middle Eastern and North African. One way to solve all of this is just to disaggregate everything so that people can then decide what are the larger categories they belong in. And that remains a priority for API Data and all of the other NCAPA member organizations working on this issue.
Thanks, Karthick. And Sina, also inviting you into this conversation if there's anything else you wanted to share, again, in terms of the work with the Data Equity Working Group or also with EPIC.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Yeah, and also for the question, building off of what Karthick had said, that's definitely a priority for EPIC as well, and something that we continue to push for, and also, in our recommendations for SPD 15 that we gave to the government a couple of years ago, we know that there was like certain categories that were included once they kind of showed us what the categories were for what they were going to include in the new SPD 15. And so in addition to that, we had asked to expand it to other groups as well, beyond Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, Tongan, and Marshallese. We asked to include Fijian, specifically the Itauke community. Those are indigenous Fijians. There is a large Itauke community in the care economy industry, and that's something that we hear directly from our Itauke community in multiple states, and a lot of it's tied to data and the lack of data.
Thanks, Sina. And so we've got another question here, and I think this can be for any one of our panelists who want to chime in. The question refers to AANHPI women do make up a portion of home care workers across the country, and under the new DOL rule are facing the loss of their minimum wage and overtime wage protections that were previously guaranteed by the Obama administration in 2013. Are we aware of any disaggregated data on AANHPI workers, which are some of the lowest paid workers, and how they'll be impacted?
So this is something that, I know that we'll need to do some deeper digging on. Depending on the data set and the sample sizes, we may hit some limits on how much we can disaggregate, but that's something that Michele and I will take back and see how to properly kind of part of it's, when you have this crosswalk between industry and occupation codes to know what's the best way to specify that population. By the way, in our Community Data Explorer, if you go to the main page, we do have industry and occupation tables, the top 10 for each group. And so some of that may be helpful, but we'll need to do some deeper digging there.
Wonderful. All right, I was just going through the chat here. I know that our panelists are getting a lot of love, and again, much appreciation to you all for sharing your insight and expertise. It's Karthick, Michele, Sandra, Sina, and Sydelle. We appreciate you and all the work that you do. And thank you again to everyone who's joined us today and tuned into the webinar. As a reminder, we've got our resources into the chat here from our partners, including the most recent LEAP Data Guide. We've got the Community Data Explorer. We've got EPIC's a report focused on economic justice, as well as a report from our friends at NAPAWF. So many thanks, everyone. Appreciate you all joining us, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care. Have a great day.